Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Nintendo gathered a lot of attention from its NES and Super NES Classic Edition consoles, and now Atari wants in on the action too. But its upcoming console isn't quite what you would expect. So right around the time that I'm filming this in early June of 2018, the Indiegogo campaign for the Atari VCS opened up pre-orders. And at first glance, you would presume that the VCS as a console is really similar to the NES or Super NES Classic. I mean, after all, it has retro styling that visually looks a lot like the original Atari 2600. It comes with a single button joystick, again, very familiar, and it's advertised as playing over 100 classic Atari games. But that's really where the similarities with Nintendo's offerings end. The VCS is actually a very different console if you start reading through its specs and additional features. It's way more powerful and the hardware is vastly different. It's based on an AMD CPU and graphics architecture. It has 4 gigs of RAM, 32 gigabytes of flash, and all of the traditional ports and connectivity options that you'd expect. HDMI, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, a micro SD card slot, a bunch of USB ports, and wired Ethernet. What's interesting is it's also running the Ubuntu Linux operating system, and it's not going to be terribly locked down. It does have the option of the classic one-button joystick, but that joystick has been updated for the modern era where it's got a built-in battery and connects wirelessly. Plus, there's a new controller that's a little more traditionally designed and shaped, much more ergonomic. It's got 2 analog sticks, a D-pad, and of course 4 action buttons on the front. And that controller bears, let's say, more than a passing resemblance to the Ouya controller, which we'll get to a little later on. But it's definitely modern specifications when it comes to console hardware. Compared to the NES and Super NES Classic editions, those consoles are very stripped down. They're very basic. They're on a system-on-a-chip type of design, and yeah, while they run Linux, the whole thing is fairly proprietary and locked down. It's not designed to be expandable. The NES and Super NES Classic are just take them out of the box, plug them into the TV, and play the games that are on them, and that's it. They don't offer internet connectivity. They don't offer any sort of expandability. There's no additional storage that you can get. They are what they are. But the VCS takes it one step further, and so where it gets quite a bit different from the other retro-themed consoles that we've seen, and not just the NES and Super NES Classic, but a lot of the other retro consoles like the ones made by At Games or the Retron series, anything like that, is that it'll also play modern games from indie developers. Yeah, there's over 100 original Atari console, like 2600 console and arcade games included with the VCS, but it's taking advantage of the hardware capability to play modern games as well. So there's going to be internet connectivity. There are multimedia apps that are said to be available. There's going to be online gameplay, and then of course an app store where you can go and get these new indie titles. So it's a really curious console and kind of makes me wonder a little bit more about it. Now, we're still fairly early on with this console. As I'm filming this, it hasn't been released. And you may be sitting here thinking, you know, that Atari console, that kind of sounds familiar. I remember hearing something about that a while back. And yeah, you did. It turns out that this was announced a year ago, right around the summer of 2017, and now is when the Indiegogo campaign is opened up to pre-orders. Now, a lot of people are responding very well to this console. At the time I'm filming this, just a few days after the pre-orders went live, they've gathered over $2 million worth of backer contributions and are approaching 10,000 people getting in on the deal. The various combinations of options for the pre-orders in terms of, what parts and pieces you get. Obviously, some are going to be more popular than others, but the fact that they got to $2 million in just a couple of days with that many people is a good sign that there's clearly some interest out there for this device. But there's a lot of information that isn't being said, that hasn't been released yet, that has me really curious. One would expect with specifications like that for it to be fairly powerful, for it to have fairly robust graphics capabilities. I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot to run retro game titles, right? I mean, like the NES, Super NES Classic, they run on a fairly low power ARM-based platform. It's all embedded. It's really, really simple. The circuit board is tiny. There aren't a whole ton of chips on it. But based on the specifications that Atari has talked about with the VCS, it sounds like it's going to be capable of quite a bit more, to be able to play those indie games fairly well. But there's also some little bit of specifications there that they've kind of hinted at but haven't called out directly that really has me curious. And that specifically has to do with the CPU and the graphics and how they relate to the design and engineering of the console. Now, one would expect in a console of the VCS's size and shape. It's definitely bigger than the classic consoles we've seen before. It's about 14 inches wide and, a few inches deep, a few inches high. But I haven't seen any reference to internal fans. You look at the pictures of this device and you don't see any obvious places for air intakes or air exhaust, any mention of noise that it might make, or if there are internal fans, airflow through the console. So I think it's safe to assume that it's going to be a fairly passive device. But that doesn't necessarily jive with some of the specifications that we have gotten about the VCS's CPU and GPU, namely that it's going to be running an AMD A10 series processor with Radeon R7 graphics. Those are very specific numbers, and they lead you down a very specific path in terms of what parts could be used in this console. One would expect, given the fact that it doesn't seem like there's going to be a fan in this console, that there's not going to be a whole lot of airflow going through it. One would expect for Atari to be using laptop grade parts, low power parts, because they offer decent performance, but they offer lower temperatures. They offer lower power consumption. And this is the same route that console manufacturers have been going. The PlayStation 4, yes, it uses a custom AMD processor, but it's based on a laptop chip architecture because it has lower thermal displacement, properties to it. It takes in less power, outputs less heat. That means the console is less likely to overheat. It means that Sony doesn't have to worry so much about exhaust fans and airflow through the console, that sort of thing. Same thing with Switch. Obviously, Switch is a portable device from the start, but it's going to be using much more power efficient and thermally efficient components. Now, if you go digging through AMD's website, you'll find one particular laptop chip that seems to fit Atari's published specs the best, specifically the Pro A10 9700B. This is a 4-core processor running at a base clock at 2.5 gigahertz, and it has a default TDP of 15 watts with Radeon R7 graphics. Now, 15 watts doesn't sound like much, but to be honest, I think that's still kind of pushing it a bit in a completely passive cooling type of situation. There is the possibility that Atari is working directly with AMD to custom spin some silicon, to custom design a chip that is maybe based on a laptop CPU die and core, but use R7 graphics with it so that you get the best of both worlds, where you can get good performance, but low power consumption and therefore low heat output. But here's the thing. You look at the pricing in the pre-orders. The console itself, on the pre-order, and yeah, it's a pre-order, so you may get a little bit of a price break versus, if or when this console goes to retail, but the console alone goes for only $200. There are bundles that come with controllers, whether it's that joystick or the new, control pad, the handheld controller with the dual analog sticks and everything. Various combinations of those go from $229 to $329. But, I can tell you this, it takes a lot of money to spin up new custom silicon. And manufacturers like AMD and Intel, while they're happy to do custom parts for other companies, just like AMD did with Sony, Sony's a much bigger name than Atari. So you kind of wonder, what's going on there? Is AMD really looking at the VCS as potentially being a big seller and is willing to put in the engineering effort to come up with a custom CPU that will work in that console? Or is there something else going on here? Now, we're still fairly early on in this console's life. It's not even been released. Apparently there have been some internal prototypes, but as far as I can tell, no publications have actually gone hands-on with any of these consoles yet. The technical details are still fairly sparse at this point, so there are a lot of questions that still need to be answered. Maybe there is a fan in the thing, and maybe even the casing design isn't final. Maybe they end up having to beef up the casing design, make it physically larger to accommodate better airflow or a bigger heatsink, or something like that. But even then, at $200 for the console, you have to look at how much in bulk even just a desktop CPU like that would go for if they have to go with off-the-shelf parts. It's possible to build a PC for $200, but it's going to be really, really tough. And so you kind of wonder what's going on with the specifications versus what Atari is going to be selling this console for and who it's targeted at. There's a lot of holes in there that still need to get filled in. Maybe they'll get filled in sooner rather than later. I'm not sure, but it does give me a little bit of pause. I'm a little bit skeptical about the specifications versus the price versus just the overall scope of this console. Xbox, Sony, the PlayStation series, they go to a manufacturer like AMD and they go, hey, for the next version of the Xbox and the next version of the PlayStation, we want a custom processor. Sight unseen, AMD or Intel or any other manufacturer would be tripping over itself to do that solution because they have a track record. Sony and Microsoft have a track record of selling a ton of those consoles being profitable, and therefore the endeavor for these component manufacturers being profitable. Atari hasn't made hardware in a very long time, at least not consumer hardware. And they're also having to fund this through an Indiegogo campaign. If I were AMD, I would question whether I wanted to do a deal like that without some significant upfront capital to get that design going. Now, that also raises another question. And again, I'm just conjecturing here, and I'm not trying to accuse anyone or anything. It's entirely possible that they're so early on in the announcement and in the sale that they're actually just guessing as to what the specifications are going to be. Maybe they're saying they think they could use an A10 series CPU with R7 graphics, but they haven't even gotten a deal going with AMD yet. When it comes to Indiegogo and Kickstarter and a lot of these other ones, we've seen this time and time again, where you've got these upstart companies that promise these sometimes just amazing products. And maybe they'll have a prototype. Maybe they'll have an engineering sample, something like that, saying this is what this product is going to do. And they release it and people go nuts and they think this is the coolest thing ever. And they put their money behind the product. And then a year goes by or 2 years go by, and all you get are just the periodic update about, oh, well, we're still working on it. We're still working on the engineering of it. Oh, we're ironing out some of the wrinkles. Oh, we've had a setback with production. We have to redesign a part of this thing or whatever. And then next thing you know, it just kind of disappears and the company goes out of business. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen with Atari, but it kind of makes you wonder. Now, that said, Atari is a pretty big name, and this thing has gotten a lot of press. And again, $2 million worth of funds have been generated on this Indiegogo campaign. Almost 10,000 people at the time I'm filming this have gotten behind this. I would be surprised if this disappeared. I am hopeful that the VCS is at least going to be able to fulfill its promise to its backers, the people who got in on this one. I think they will get a console. But will it be the same console when it ships as to what they're promising now? I'm not sure. Again, because we haven't seen any real prototypes out in the wild. It's not like they're just around the corner from firing up production on this one. We don't know. We don't know what's going to change. And in fact, if you look at their production schedule, you gain some more questions, right? I mean, this thing was announced in mid-2017, and it's taken them a year to get to just the pre-order stage. But if you look at that Indiegogo campaign page, all of the pre-order options, they're not going to start shipping until July of 2019. And in several places on the campaign page, like they should, admittedly, but in several places on that campaign page, they call out very specifically, actual ship dates and timetables and everything are subject to change. It's going to be 2 years from announcing this product to it actually shipping, and a year between taking people's money and actually shipping it. This is Atari, right? This isn't some, person working out of their garage trying to make this happen. Atari has this wealth of intellectual property. It's licensed out its name. It's licensed out its products for a very long time now. It couldn't come up with the money on its own faster to get this product into production. It couldn't accelerate this process to get it into production faster. I mean, okay, maybe they needed to do the Indiegogo campaign to give them the extra push, and I wouldn't fault them for that. But really, they're going to let this thing sit for 2 years before it launches? Kind of makes you wonder. The upside, again, it's a very highly visible campaign. Atari's a big name. It's not like they're just going to completely disappear. Like I said, there is this wealth of intellectual property that they have. So I think everyone who buys one of these is going to get it. But it also raises questions about the whole nature of the console. It feels to me like it's got this weird split personality, if that makes any sense. You look at the NES, Super NES Classic Edition, or you look at those AtGames consoles, or you look at the Retron. They're very narrowly focused, right? They are meant for playing retro games, a very specific library of retro games, and they're priced accordingly. Super NES Classic was $80, NES Classic was $60. Those AtGames consoles, they generally range between anywhere like $30 to $60, something like that. I don't think any of the Retrons go more than about $100, and those are the multifunction kind of ones. They're priced appropriate to what they're able to do. Now, a lot of the design, of course, of the VCS, but also a lot of the branding and the marketing and everything leans on the whole Atari 2600. It leans on the retro angle of the console. And so it's going to attract interest from people who are, of course, interested in playing retro games, right? Just like the NES, Super NES Classic did. The people who played those games as a kid, they want to get back into them again now. Or the people now who are collectors and want to be able to play those games maybe in better quality on their TV, or want to get their kids involved in those games because, they played them when they were kids. And, all of these different, kind of slices of cultures and age groups and ethnicities and everything, lots of different people, may find the retro gaming aspect of that console interesting. So they're going to get attracted to it. But then they're going to look at the price and they're going to go $200 to $300, depending on the combo that you get, which controllers you want. That $200 is just the console itself, no controllers. Now, you can use your own controllers, of course, but I mean, you're going to be playing retro games, these classic Atari games. What are you going to use? Like an Xbox controller? Most people are going to find that weird. You're going to want to at least buy the classic Atari, one button joystick type of thing. So that's going to bump the price up some more. But they're going to look at that price. They're going to look at that price at $200 and they're going to go, I haven't been that involved in gaming and I don't know if I would play it enough to justify $200. So in a way, this console is too expensive for just retro gamers. Now you look at the other side of the console and it's fairly robust hardware specs for the money. Will this thing be able to keep up with a PS4 or an Xbox One or even a Nintendo Switch? No, I don't think so. I don't think it will. But it's definitely better than one of those embedded consoles. So it kind of sits in the middle, which is also a little weird in and of its own. But from the whole indie gaming side of things, you kind of look at it and go, well, $200, it's almost too cheap. It's almost too low power to really get the best out of potentially the kind of games that are going to be coming out for it. Now, careful curation of the titles that get released could, yield a really interesting library of games that play really well and look really good, but don't require a ton of horsepower to run. I'm thinking games like Celeste, not like really, really heavy 3D types of titles. I don't think you're going to see much by way of like first-person shooters on the VCS or anything like that. But maybe retro-styled indie games or, titles that just need less power to run and look and play good. There's an opportunity there. But that's kind of a small market in and of itself. And like I said earlier on in the episode, talking about how that new controller, not the joystick, but the actual gamepad type of controller. When I looked at that controller, I thought about the Ouya and I thought, the VCS is actually really similar to the Ouya when it comes to the whole point of the gaming, right? The Ouya is meant to be kind of that whole indie gaming type of thing. It's not the most powerful console either, but it's not this super cheap, really low-end embedded system. But the Ouya has an emphasis on being able to write your own games and kind of an open atmosphere to coding and getting access into the system and development and all that. The VCS has a similar thing going on too, and I think that's partially why it's advertised as being running Ubuntu Linux instead of some proprietary lockdown OS or Linux derivative or anything like that. And if you look at some of the specs, Atari's talking about how you might be able to develop for the console yourself and get into a sandbox mode, they call it, in the VCS where you can kind of tinker and play. And they'll accept open submissions for games. So if you are an indie developer, you can get in touch with Atari and fill out all sorts of legal paperwork and stuff, and they'll evaluate your game. But you might be able to get your game on that, that app store, whatever they're going to call it, for the VCS owner so that they can, buy and download your indie title. But here's the thing, the Ouya, as cool of a concept of a console as it was, it never lit the world on fire. It just didn't. It's unfortunate that it didn't, because I thought and felt it really had an interesting angle to gaming. It had a lot of potential, but it just didn't resound in the mass market. And sad to say, if you don't really push people in the mass market to adopt your product, you're going to be a niche player for a long time, or it's just going to kind of fade out. So that's my fear with the VCS, is that because it's got this weird split personality where it's part retro gaming, and titles like that, but also part kind of Ouya indie development, middle of the road performance, decent price if you look at it as a complete package, but I can't see people standing in a store going, do I want to buy a PS4 or do I want to buy a VCS? Right? We're not going to see that. Same thing with people wanting, like a Switch. Do I want to buy a Switch or do I want to buy a VCS? If you want a VCS, it's because you specifically want that product and you probably also own other game consoles. And that's a really tough market to break into. We've seen it with the Ouya. We've even seen it with the Steam Box. The Steam Box really never took off too much, even though it was also a really cool concept. So my big concern is going to be just staying power with the VCS. Is this going to be something, despite the initial really strong reaction on Indiegogo, lots of backers, lots of money, to this console, is it really going to attract people over the long term? Is it going to become a legit console platform in its own right, or is it just going to be more one and done? I'm not sure, and I guess only time will tell. Of course, I am curious as to your thoughts. This was actually a topic that was raised by a bunch of people on Twitter when I asked what they wanted me to talk about for this week's podcast, and quite a few people said VCS, so clearly there's some interest out there amongst my viewers and subscribers. So let me know what you think. Are you excited for this console? Does it make sense to you? Is there some part of it that I'm missing that I didn't cover? I'm just curious. I mean, there's many different ways to go with this console and this topic because it's so early on in its life. I think we'd be having a very different discussion if it was a real, concrete product and I had one in front of me and was able to say this is what it does and this is what it doesn't do and do a proper review on it. But it's still very nebulous. So really the only thing we have to go off of is a concept. But does that concept make sense to you? Let me know. Hit me up down in the comments and let's continue the discussion. Also, if you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, I have them available for Patreon supporters at all contribution levels. As little as $1 a month gets you access to them. They go up a few days before they show up on YouTube, and there's a private RSS feed that you can throw into the podcast player of your choice, and it'll just show up in your podcast player as soon as it becomes available. So just something to think about if you want to help support the channel. Anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.